Hey everybody, welcome to the first mix breakdown video I've done in maybe over a year. Today I'm going to be talking about a track that I recently mixed for the artist Isaac Solo called You Took That Photo. And I figure I'm just going to start it like I've started all the other ones, which is by playing through the artist's rough mix and talking about it and talking about what I thought was working and what I thought needed improvement. And then I'll play my finished mix so that you can get a sense of kind of where I took things, and then I'll go through and start breaking it down track by track. But just to start, here's the artist's rough.
You took the photo of us. I didn't know it that well in my hand. Write down a story of us. Too soon to lay my hand My bones are ready. Turn on the radio. So cold and steady. You try and fake a love. You know you have. You know you have. You don't believe it. You know you have. You think I'd carry on and make everything worse? Can we just wait for a moment when everything just hurts? My bones are ready. Turn on the radio. So cold and steady. You try and fake a love. You know you have. You know you have. You don't believe it. You know you have. You don't believe it.
Okay, cool. So I have some notes written down. The first thing is not so much a critique, but just one of the first things that I noticed listening through is that um, main chord progression that is played on the guitar is just very central to the whole song. I mean, it's the main sort of non-vocal harmonic element. So I wanted to make sure that in my mix that was featured and well articulated. So that's the first note I have. The second note is that one of the things that I really like about this song is how sort of dark and atmospheric and kind of soupy it is, but at the same time, and this often happens when there's a lot of reverb, but just that the lower mid range feels like it needs to be a little bit cleaned up. uh, especially the sort of the bass, guitar, lower range of the vocal all sort of feel like they're stepping on each other. So that was something that I wanted to take care of in the mix and not make it feel sort of sterile and clinical, but just make sure that everything speaks properly. Another thing, and this was something that Isaac indicated in his mix documentation, was that he just felt like the whole thing needed to build a little bit more from section to section. You know, again, when you have a repeating chord progression throughout the whole song, and in this case, programmed looped elements like the drums, anything to create sort of shifts in feel over time and sort of changes in perspective is important. So that's one thing that I had. Let's see. Another thing that Isaac wrote is that the drums, he felt like the drums needed to be a little bit more propulsive, which I agree with. And then the last thing that I have on my notes is that just that I have the last refrain, you know, where there's that sampled, sort of chopped, reversed vocal loop. Felt like that could feel more climactic. It sort of relates to the previous note, but or the note before that. But yeah, so that's what I have. Let me go ahead and play what I ended up with. I'm just gonna play maybe half of my mix. So here's how that sounds.
You took the photo of us. I didn't know it then, but I let my hand write down a story of us. Too soon I let my hand My bones are ready. Turn on the radio. So cold and steady. You try and fake a love you know you have. You know you have. You don't believe it. You know you have. You think I'd carry on and make everything worse? Can we just wait for a moment when everything just hurts?
Okay, cool. So yeah, so hopefully that gives a good sort of sense of where I took things with the mix. I'm just gonna get started talking about specifics, but just quickly before I do that, I do want to talk about session setup and gain staging and stuff. I'm not going to get into too many specifics because I've talked about that stuff in previous videos, but I do just want to give a quick sort of lay of the land. Basically, the way that this works is, and this is pretty similar to what a lot of mixers do, is that I have you know, discrete instrumental subgroups for each instrumental category. So the gist of it is that the drums all go to, right, the drums, all the audio tracks are red, and they all get routed to a drum subgroup. And, you know, similarly, all the percussion, here, I'll go to waveform. The percussion is all orange, goes to a percussion subgroup, bass, blue, bass subgroup, guitar subgroup, so on and so forth. That's basically it. There's some more sort of nuance to it, but the only other thing I'll say is that typically I am not reluctant, but I just don't typically do a lot of insert processing on the subgroup, on the sort of master subgroups themselves. I tend to do processing on individual tracks, and yeah, if you want to, like I said, if you want to sort of know more about my session setup and template, I cover that stuff in other videos. But yeah, I'm just gonna get into it. And typically, when I mix, I tend to start with the bass and drums and sort of get a good foundation going there. But like I said, since that guitar chord progression is so central to the track, when I was mixing this, that's where I started. Typically, I'll start with one or two instrumental elements and then bring in the vocal to get a feel. So I'm gonna start with the guitar and then I'll go to bass and drums. But let me just play these down. So first thing that we have on the guitar is this reversed sample-y kind of thing. Which I'm not processing at all. And that, except, obviously my mix bus processing, and I'll get into that. But next up is the main guitar, which I talked about, and that definitely has a lot of processing going on. So I'm gonna bypass everything and just play it as it came to me. Now I should say that this is Isaac's wet guitar stem. So I ask my clients if it's going to be a multi-track stem delivery and not a Pro Tools session. I ask them to send both dry versions of their audio tracks with all of their sort of processing taken off, and then wet versions. In this case, Isaac had chorusing and reverb and stuff, and so I used what he already had. So I'm going to play that. Here's what that sounds like. And it sounds pretty good. To me, like I said, I wanted this guitar to be really sort of articulated, and that meant bringing out the sort of sound of the pick on strings or the fingernails on strings. So the first step in the chain is this compressor. It's an LA3A, and it's not level matched. So there will be a level jump, but it's just kind of keeping everything steady. It's not doing a whole lot of gain reduction. 1 or 2 dB. Thickening it up a little bit. Next up is this imager, and in its current state, it's actually not doing any sort of widening. I'm really just using it as a pan knob, just balancing out the signal a little bit, and then that's followed by an EQ, and I'm doing a few things. The first of which is, like I said, boosting this zone where the articulation lies. I'll just solo that band. Next is a low cut here, just getting rid of some sub frequencies. And then you'll see that there's this inactive bell curve cutting in the low mid range, and that is automated. And there's a lot of automation going on throughout the song. I should say automation of EQs. In this case, I'll go to the band bypass. So in this case, the this low frequency cut is disabled for the entire first verse. But then when the bass and the drums come in the chorus and throughout the rest of the song, there's a low end cut just to make room for all of that stuff. And you'll see there's a lot of automation that goes on in the track. So that's the EQ. And then I have a sidechain compressor being triggered by the kick drum, and this is something that I don't typically do a whole lot of, but you'll see that it's all over this track. And this goes back to the note wanting to make the drums feel more propulsive. Oftentimes, if the kick drum is super busy, this can end up making things sound choppy, and it's not particularly transparent. But because the kick is just sort of holding down the 1 and the 3, just some subtle sidechain compression on the sort of pad-like elements helps the kick cut through. So here's what that sounds like. You see, it's not reducing a whole lot, 3 dB. And then there's more. Well, there's a chorus here with more automation on the dry wet. So here a lot of things happen at the transition between this verse and chorus. So I'll just play here. Here's before, and you can see that the dry wet gets rolled up. So here's how it sounds without. And here's with. Just sort of spreads it out, makes it spacier. And again, this helps the chorus feel bigger, but it also helps just vary the feel of what is otherwise, essentially a looped part, and just shifts the perspective throughout. You can see in the first verse there's no chorus, and then in the chorus there is chorus, and then no chorus, and then some chorus, and so that's something that I like to do, is just constantly be kind of shifting things. And then the final thing is just this little corrective kind of EQ, just getting rid of some of the boxiness or not boxiness, sort of the honkiness in the mid range, and that's just in the center channel. And then the last thing is this barely audible guitar slap. I think it's an Echoplex kind of thing. Yeah, just setting it back a little bit. So that's the main guitar. And I should also say that when I'm doing these videos, I'm kind of just going through all the plugin processing. What is unspoken is the fact that all of this, is carefully balanced, and that is actually where most of the heavy lifting in a mix is done. It's not through any of the processing. It's just through the basic, level balancing. That stuff is hard to demonstrate and hard to kind of explain. But so I just talk about the plugins and techniques like that. But the balancing is always super important. Next up is this guitar. So the last guitar, and it's this sort of sparkly arpeggiated part that happens in the choruses. And I'll play it without any of the processing. So here's how it came to me. And here's what I'm doing. So the first thing is an EQ, pretty simple, just cutting low end. That's all taken care of by the bass and the main guitar itself. So I didn't need a whole lot of low end. And then the rest is just some corrective EQ notches. And then I have a mod delay, which is basically just a left-right offset delay. The left channel has no delay, and the right channel is about 40 milliseconds of delay. And that just helps sort of spread it out. But the other thing that I'm doing here is I'm modulating the pitch, subtly and out of sync on both sides. So there's this sort of stereo vibrato effect that adds a sense of movement. This is without. With again, just adds some swimminess. And then the next thing is this phaser, which is essentially doing performing a similar task, and that's just a multi-mono left channel and right channels are doing different things, just adding more modulation. So here's without, with, and then finally just another sidechain compressor getting linked to the kick drum. They're getting triggered by the kick drum. So that's all the guitar. Like I said, I am going to go to the drums and bass. Another thing that I should say is that this is not my typical workflow, just in that I don't go through and solo individual elements. I try to get a balance going pretty quickly, and then sort of add processing as needed, as opposed to going one by one, adding things in. But just for demonstration purposes, it makes things easy to sort of go track by track. So I am going to, let me make sure the guitars are unsoloed. Yep. I'm going to play the kick drum, and And I'm not doing much at all. I'm actually not doing anything in the first verse. I'm not doing anything in the first verse. I have one plugin and it's bypassed in the first verse. So let me just play what the kick drum sample sounds like as it came to me. It's not a whole lot of low end. So in the chorus, I just have this low air plugin that gets added, and that's really just adding sub frequencies, giving the kick some weight. So here's what that sounds like. And that's it. That's all I'm doing on the kick drum. Next up is the snare, which I am EQing. One of these EQs is constant throughout the track. It's just a low end cut. The snare is pretty sort of hefty, so I'm cutting, I believe, just right below the fundamental frequency. Then the next EQ is automated. So this one, let's see, is enabled for that verse, and it's just a high cut. And then when the chorus comes in, and subsequently the rest of the song, it's bypassed, and so the top opens up. And this is a way to sort of indicate a dynamic shift without actually, turning the volume knob. Oftentimes, this sort of like, sort of boosted a dB in the chorus thing, boost the mix bus a dB. Those sort of changes, those sectional dynamic changes can often get sort of knocked back down in mastering. So I always think it's important to find ways to create sort of tonal shifts that indicate, oh, here's a louder section, but through the use of things like filtering and panning and mono and then widening. So this is an example of that, and I use this sort of throughout the track, this filtering the top end and then opening things up. So that's the snare drum, and then it's going to 3 reverbs. The first 2 of which are pretty just simple, straightforward. One is a Valhalla plate reverb, sort of a bright plate, and then the other one is a room. I love this Brainworks mid-side room reverb thing. And then the other one is more of an effecty kind of thing, and that is this gated and distorted snare reverb, which I will play soloed. So it's this Avid, just stock with Pro Tools. I really like this plugin, but it's just a dense, trashy kind of reverb going into another stock with Pro Tools, a Sans amp, just to kind of give it crunch, and then a gate, which is being triggered by the snare signal itself. And that's just adding sustain and a little bit of weight to the snare. So again, here's kick and snare together. I'll start playing in the chorus. Okay, next up is this tom, and I'll play it without any processing. So here's how it came to me. And, it's clearly a sequenced part, just a looped thing. And I just felt like I wanted it to feel a little more natural, a little more played. And so I did a few things. The first thing is I just sent it to the room and the plate reverbs, just to put it in the same space as the snare, set it back a little bit. And then there's a sidechain compressor, again being triggered by the kick, and this is just helping it, breathe a little bit more. So here it is without that sidechain compressor. And with. It's subtle, but it helps. And then an EQ, cutting off some unnecessary kind of subbiness, and then just a dynamic high shelf, just acting on the transient, helping it feel a little less ticky. followed by a multiband compressor, which is only affecting the sort of fundamental tom frequency. And this is being triggered by a combination of the kick and the snare. So essentially, on every quarter note, the fundamental frequency, the sort of low end of the tom, gets ducked. And this just helps, the snare is sort of quite low end heavy, as is the kick when the low air plugin is active. So this just helps with low end buildup. See it. And it is being triggered by the snare. You just don't see it because the send is on the snare bus and not the snare track itself. But yeah, okay, so the next is just 2 EQs, and they're both being automated. The first one is active in the first verse, and it's just rolling off top end again, doing the sort of high-end roll-off thing. And then the second one is active in, I believe, verse 2, and it's doing the same thing, just rolling off less high end. Without. And again, that just helps things open up when they need to in the sort of big sections. So here's kick, snare, tom. This is sort of the core drum sound. I'll play it from the chorus where it's all full bandwidth. Another thing that the tom is doing that's really important is it's adding front end to the kick drum transient. The kick by itself is a good sound, but it's pretty round. It doesn't exactly sort of cut. And the tom adds a sort of tickiness to the front end of that kick. Okay, next up, I'm just going to increase the size of the waveforms. Next up is the cymbals, and I'm really not doing that much. 2 of these cymbals are what came with the track. Then there's a third one that I'll talk about. The first one is just this reverse thing, which I'm doing nothing to. And then there's this main crash. And I think I'm just cutting high end. Yeah. This sample sounds sort of digital to me. And what do I mean by that? You can hear during the decay, there's some artifacts. It sounds like it's sort of aliasing a little bit. And so this EQ just sort of helps cut down some of that high frequency harshness. So there's this one other cymbal, and this is one that I added. And typically, I'm pretty reluctant to take too many production liberties when I'm mixing, just because I feel like it's not my place, and I don't want to overstep. But this is the fourth song that I've done with Isaac, and so I feel we have a good enough working relationship at this point where if I do something that he doesn't like, it's fine. He can just tell me. But so I'll get to that, but I just want to play the drums without that cymbal, so you can at that transition into the chorus. So I just felt like I wanted the cymbal to feel a little bit bigger, a little bit more sort of enveloping, and not to decay so quickly. And so I added a sample that's just a little bit more washy, and it sounds like this. And again, not doing much, just cutting some low end stuff and then some mid range harshness, and then it's followed up by this sidechain compressor, again being triggered by the kick. So that's the drums. There's some bus processing stuff that I'm going to talk about later because that affects the bass too. But that is the drums, and then there's percussion. First up is this tambourine. Now, in the first mix pass that I sent to Isaac, it was just this one tambourine. and one of his notes was that it sounded a little too bright, and so I duplicated the track and just pitched it down an octave and combined them. So for a sound like this, it feels just a little more tactile. Maybe a little bit more like somebody's actually hitting the tambourine with a stick. So what am I doing? So I'm basically doing the same thing on each one. I'm just doing on the main one, on the unshifted one, just a little, there was a frequency that was bothering me apparently. And then I'm doing a studio reverb. Again, this is this sort of trashy reverb. In this case, using it as an insert with the mix at sort of 50%. And with tambourine, with a lot of percussion, but especially tambourine, I kind of like it. I like reverbs with audible pre-delay, where it feels like the tambourine hits and then there's a splash. So this is about 100 seconds of pre-delay. And then finally an EQ rolling off top end. And I believe, the bypass on that is automated. So again, it's active in the verse and then bypassed in the choruses. And then the other tambourine it's all the same stuff. It's just this pitch shifter plugin and then a low end cut. That's the only difference. So that's the tambourines. And then the last sort of consistent percussion thing is this stompy, roomy stomp, rattle, percussion-y thing. What am I doing? I'm cutting low end throughout the whole track. I'm adding another mod delay. This time I'm not doing any sort of left-right modulation at all. It's just, let's see, the right channel, or rather the left channel is delayed 25 milliseconds. I find that with roomy elements like this, they can often afford to be sort of really widened out, and it helps with the perspective. So here's without. It's basically a mono signal, I think. Yeah. And with. And then again, there's a high roll-off that gets automated in the choruses. So let me play that. So I'm going to play, I'll just play all of that stuff in the chorus. The final percussive element that I want to talk about is this church bell, and this is another element I added, and it's sort of doing two things. The first thing that it's doing is it's just supplementing that cymbal hit that I added. They're playing on top of each other. So, oops. It's just adding some resonance. You can't really hear it as a distinct church bell in that section. But then later in the track, and this goes back to my note about wanting the final refrain to feel bigger or to feel like some sort of shift, is that I'm actually... I added a sort of rhythmic figure that happens on the church bell. I'll just play that. Again, I'd typically be pretty wary of doing anything like this. It's pretty sort of radical from my perspective, but it does get sort of eaten up in the mix by the guitar, because the guitar is sort of acting in that range, and like I said, Isaac is a cool guy, and if he hated it, he would tell me, and we would just move on. So that's the drums and the percussion. Again, there's some bus stuff that I'll talk about. Next up is the bass. I'll just play it from the chorus. And this came to me with that cool chorus on it. And you can hear that it's pretty much playing root notes. It's not a super busy part. And so my idea with it was to do a similar thing with the guitar, which was just to bring out the articulation, make it feel more played as opposed to just one sort of, thing of bass going through the whole track. So here's what I did. Well, I'll bypass everything and just add things in one by one, and hopefully it's sort of level matched. Okay, so here it is dry, or as it came to me. It's actually his wet stem. So first thing is this center plugin. This is just bringing the low frequencies, making them a little bit more mono. It's not super radical, but just helps tighten it up a little bit. Followed by this API channel plugin from Lindell/Plugin Alliance, and it's doing a few things. The first one is that I'm just cranking the input on the preamp module, and these plugins have a really good gain sort of matching unity thing. So when you crank the gain, it doesn't blow the output. So there's the preamp. The next thing I'm doing is I'm boosting about 700 hertz, so 3-ish dB. Just again, that's sort of the it's not quite the pick on string frequency. It's just more of the sort of articulated point to the bass. There's that, and then the other thing I'm doing is this FET compression. I think this is my first time using this this compressor on a mix. It just helps even it out and helps give it again that point. So here's without, with. Next up is another sidechain compressor, again being triggered by the kick, and another EQ rolling off some subs because the kick sort of takes care of that in that zone in the choruses, and then some boxiness, and then finally boosting. This is sort of where that pick on string kind of gritty articulation lies. Multi-band compressor being triggered by the kick drum, just cutting sub-frequencies. Crossover point is at 60 hertz, and the slope is, I think, as high as it goes. Yeah, just about 40, 50, yeah, 45, 40, 46.5 dB per octave. And then the last thing is this EQ, which I believe, yeah, there's this bass motif, or this bass riff, I should say, in the verses. That I felt, because I had rolled off so many high frequencies on other elements, it just felt like it popped out a little too much, like it was too clean. So I'm just rolling off high frequency, and then by the time the next sort of bass part rolls around, that's off. Last thing on the bass is this parallel process. I'm using my built-in parallel compression bus, but it's actually parallel saturation, and it's a SansAmp, and it's just driving, again, getting articulation from the front end of the pick-on string. So here it is without, and with. It's subtle. Here it is soloed. Just pushes it a little bit. Let me play all of that together. Okay, there's one more thing on the bass actually that I didn't mention, which is that there's this EQ, and I'm basically cutting a whole lot of low end in the verse leading up to the chorus. You can see it's active. Right, the guitar again is filling up a lot of low end here. Not so much the subby stuff. Now it's bypassed and it opens up. The whole low end extends. Sorry, I'm going to try not to talk so much over the audio while it's playing. But yes, I said the whole sort of low end extends down. The whole track sort of opens up, the high frequencies and the low frequencies once the chorus comes in, and it sort of shifts into gear. Or at least that's the intention. Next thing, and and this goes back to the bus processing. I'm doing parallel processing on the entire drum and bass bus with this tape saturator, this tape plugin from Baby Audio, which I love. And I'm basically, it's not even so much saturation as it is just all out, distortion. By itself, it sounds terrible. But with the track, it just adds like this sort of heft and weight to it. So here it is without. Here's all the elements soloed, but without the tape saturation. And here's with. Subtle, but just brings it some density, brings the kick some point. There's that, and then two things on the drum and bass bus. I know I said I typically don't use insert processing on sort of subgroups, but in this case I am, and I'm using a Shadow Hills compressor. In this case, just using the discrete circuit, not the optical. Not doing a whole lot of reduction. But it's a slow attack and a fast release, and so it's letting through the punch of the kick and then kind of clamping down. So it's just adding some glue to it, letting the kick transient come through. Let me bypass it so you can hear what it sounds like without. And with. One of the things that gives this compressor a ton of character is the transformer emulation. And what I always do, I don't have sort of a go-to one because it's highly dependent on the source material. And so whenever I have this plugin inserted, I always check each one of the transformers and see which one I like best. In this case, it was the steel. And then the last thing on the drum and bass bus is this limiter. And this is sort of serving two purposes. One is just sort of a boring technical purpose that I don't want too many transients hitting, or I don't want too many sort of pointy drum transients hitting the mix bus limiter, because then that limiter is bringing down not only the kick when it limits, but it's also bringing down all the other program material, and so it can make things feel kind of shredded a little bit. And so this is catching those peaks before it hits the limiter down the chain. That's the boring technical thing. The other thing that it's doing is it's adding a character to the drums that I really like. It's almost responsible for a lot of the kick drum point. So I'll just play it without. And with. Without. And with. It brings, without, it feels like the kick is sort of being eaten up by the bass, and with it feels like the kick and the bass are sort of playing off each other. So there's that. That's the Brainworks limiter. Okay, so that's most of the harmonic elements. The only thing that's left is a synth, I think. Let me just play that real quick. I'll just play the transition into the chorus with all the elements that I've gone through. I'll play it in this section so that you can hear the church bells and see how they sort of blend into the guitars. Okay, the last harmonic element that I'm going to talk about, or the last instrumental element, is the synth, this sort of string synth part. And I'm not doing a whole lot to it. I'm EQing it throughout. Just cutting low end and boosting mid range just to give it some presence and help it cut. Here it is without. and width. There is a side chain, again being triggered by the kick. And then let's see, what's the wrong thing? A pan man, which is basically doing sort of a stereo tremolo kind of thing. It's only active in the second pre-chorus, this where he sings these oohs, and then the outro sounds like this. Just gives it some sort of movement. And then the last thing is, again, in that final chorus or refrain, I'm calling it, just to give it more lift, I'm sending it to a crystallizer. And in this case, because the synth part is so, it's just one note, it's really almost just acting as a pitch shift. That's what that sounds like by itself. So that's the synth, and the entire instrumental. Let me play that so you can get a sense of how it sounds. I'll play it in the first chorus. Okay, next up is vocals. And the first, I'm just going to talk about the lead vocals first. So I am doing another sort of production-y thing that is, maybe a little bit more radical than what I would usually do, but I thought that the track called for it. And that is this sort of radio filtered, distorted effect in the first verse. And all it is a decapitator.
Write down a story fast.
Here's without.
Write down a story fast.
Right, so it's adding grit and mid-range and cutting off top end again, so that by the time the chorus comes in full bandwidth, it sounds great and expansive. And more to that point, I'm cutting off again low and top end, just filtering it, basically band passing it, and then just some dynamic cuts here where there were some build-up resonances. This is an EQ that is active for the entire track, and you can see, I'll just click around. It's not doing a whole lot, but occasionally there will be some frequencies that get boosted or ducked. This is something that I do in pretty much every mix. I just find that a lot of vocals need, certain frequencies stick out at certain points, and instead of adding a dynamic band where I don't have as much control as I would like, I'd rather just go through, put all of these bands in touch mode, and just, as the track runs down, just tuck certain things down or up as needed. And then the final thing, and this is automated, is this RVox compressor. Just helps keep, when the decapitator is active, it just helps keep the level steady and focused and forward. I've said this in previous videos. I don't typically go to compressors for dynamics control. I mean, that is sort of a byproduct of what they do. But you can see here that I'm doing a whole lot of level automation, right? If something is too quiet and then it's too loud, I'm not going to go to a compressor. I'm going to automate it. What I see compressors as being useful for is adding character and vibe to a signal. If I want a transparent level control, again, I'll just pull faders. So that is the sort of automated stuff. Let me just play I'll play the first line of the verse, and then I'll play the first line of the chorus, so you can kind of hear the difference.
You took the photo of us. I didn't know it then, but I let my hand.
And then here's the chorus.
My bones are ready.
Right, everything opens up. Now, these plugins are constant throughout, and the first one is just an EQ, boosting that sort of 2K.
My bones are ready.
the sort of intelligibility of the vocal. That is like where the main vocal harmonic information lies. And then just doing a low end and a low mid cut. I typically find that on vocals, and you'll see this on the background vocal, that I'll usually do a low cut, and then there will be maybe one or two lower mid range resonances that I need to take care of. So that's the vocal EQ. And whenever, really whenever I remember to, I always try and keep my vocal EQs, if I'm using the Pro Q3, in natural phase. I find that it doesn't really matter for other instruments so much, but for vocals, for whatever reason, this is it just sounds much more transparent to me. So there's the vocal EQ, followed by another LA3A. I tend to use this for sort of more, if I need something like grabby and gluey, I will go for something more like an 1176, something a little more snappy, where I want the kind of articulation of the transients to come through. In this case, because the vocal is so sort of winding and it's this legato part, the LA3A just does this sort of gentle, but it just sort of brings out character, but still sounds pretty transparent.
My bones are ready.
It's doing 5-7 dB of gain direction, but you don't hear it grabbing down the signal. Next thing is soothe.
My bones are ready.
Just again taking out some of this stuff, but doing it, selectively, dependent on the program material. Then it's followed by a de-esser, and this is one of my favorite de-essers, and it's been around forever. And it looks, I guess they have new skins for it, but I like the one that looks like it was built in 2003, and it's really transparent, and I love it. And typically on vocal de-essers, what I'll do is I will use it in wideband mode, and so what that means is that instead of just acting on a specific frequency or frequency range, it is being triggered by a specific frequency, right? If the level of a certain frequency, in this case 5.5K, crosses a certain threshold, the de-esser will activate, but instead of only pulling down a specific range, it pulls down the entire signal. And I find that just makes things sound, again, more transparent, more natural. So that's all the insert processing on the lead vocals. The other lead vocal track that you see here is these oohs. And I'm just EQing. Same EQ as before. I think same compressor as before. This decapitator here, by the way, on the main vocal is it's inactive for the entire song except the very, very end when the wet knob rolls up and just distorts, just to give it some breakup. But so that's the lead vocal with all the insert processing. I will talk about my parallel processing, and it's just two things. The first is this chain, which is actually an Andrew Sheps trick, I believe. And it's basically a Pultec boosting into an LA2A, and then a Pultec doing almost the inverse thing, but not quite, right? So you see that here, this Pultec, the first Pultec in the chain, is boosting at 8K and also cutting at 100. And then it's boosting into this LA2A, and then subsequently the following Pultec is attenuating at 10K, right? The attenuation select, so it's different. It's attenuating 10K, but boosting 8K. It's not attenuating quite as much. And then a boost at 100 hertz. But as you might know, the boost and attenuation on a Pultec don't actually cancel each other out. So what the result is something, basically it adds presence without it sounding harsh or overly bright. So here's what that sounds like, and it's subtle. Here it is by itself. I'll just turn it up so you can hear it.
Turn on the radio, so cold and steady.
Blended in with the main vocal.
My bones are ready. Turn on the radio.
Okay, and then the other parallel process that I have going on, and I use this pretty frequently, is a parallel. I'll turn off the reverb send so you can hear it clearly. It's a parallel saturation, and what I'm doing is, it's Neve, it's a Neve 80 series channel strip. Only thing I'm doing is I'm cranking the preamp, so it's breaking up.
My bones are red.
Oops, I'll play that in solo. Oops, followed by a micro shift, which is just spreading it out. And then an EQ, just getting rid of some bottom and some top. Focusing it a little bit. And then that in turn goes to two mono plate reverbs, one of which is in, I'll pull those up. One of which is an EMT 140, and the other one is this Liquid Sonic 7th Heaven, which is an emulation of the Percussion M7 reverb. It is basically, as I understand it, it's all the algorithms of the M7, which is a hardware unit, but without it doesn't emulate the conversion. So there's a slight difference, but it's pretty much a Percussion. And basically what these two things do is they're set to similar settings. They're both, plate plugins, but they're obviously, the impulse responses are different. And so the left and right frequency, or the left and right information is different. And so it helps widen things out. It's just a wide plate reverb signal. So here's what that all sounds like together.
My bones are ready. Turn on the radio.
Okay, and then the last couple things I'm going to talk about with the lead vocal is just the time-based effects. There are two reverbs and two delays. The first reverb is this hall, and it's just doing throws on the sort of long sustained notes in the verses and choruses. So
my bones are ready.
Here, I'll mute the returns so that you can just hear the. Oops, let me mute the Percussion stuff too. Oops, let's see what I do. Oh, I need this.
My bones are ready. Turn on the radio.
So you can hear it kind of coming up behind the vocal. Let's unmute all that stuff. Just a hall reverb. And then the other one is this Lexicon. It's a 480L, and it's just a preset that I built, and it's just a very long hall, and it's not dense at all. It doesn't clog up the signal, and just a little low end cut behind it. So here's what that stuff sounds like together. I'll mute the delays.
My bones are ready. Turn on the radio.
And then I have two delays, and one of them is constant and plays throughout, and that is the slap.
Write down a story of us.
It's just this filtered, practically no feedback, wide slap that just gives the vocal some dimension.
Write down a story of us.
Here's without.
Too soon to lay my hand
And with.
down.
And then the other thing is this ping pong delay that happens in the choruses. If I can find the send, it's here. So you can see it's just happening in the choruses and sounds like this.
My bones
Just left, right. And this is another thing that I'm big on. Obviously the vocal is shifting throughout the course of the song, with the radio effect processing and the filtering and all that stuff. But as much as I can sort of constantly be throwing to different reverbs and adding delay and then taking out delay. I find that stuff always, you don't necessarily want it to be super discernible because otherwise it's distracting. But subtle shifts in perspective can keep the listener engaged. So I'm big on doing stuff like that. So that's the vocal reverb and delay. The last thing with the vocal effects is you might have heard that sort of tremolo effect in the chorus on that word radio. I'll solo that up so you can hear it a bit better. And that's an automated sort of thing that I have going on the entire vocal effects return bus. It is a decapitator. The mix is automated, right? So it's, oops, here we go. And then into this tremolator from Soundtoys. It just happens that one part, and again, it's just maybe stepping on the toes of the production a little bit, but Isaac said he liked it, so it was cool. Okay, that's the vocal effects stuff. Let me go quickly through the background vocals. First thing is, well, I'll go through these reverse vocal groups. So the first one is this, which I'm not processing. And then it goes to this. All I'm doing is kind of notching out one frequency that's bothering me. And then there's this, the main vocal chop during the refrain. Getting rid of some low mid-range resonance. Into another one of those de-essers, just right there is an S that was bothering me. Into a doubler, and this was interesting. Here it is without the doubler. And with. So this was something that to me felt like, without the doubler, it sat really well in the track, but I almost wanted it to feel like somebody was pressing a button and there's a sample coming in that was just like, that didn't live in the same sonic space as the track. I wanted it to feel like somebody kind of pressing a button. And so this doubler, in addition to just clearing out room for the center stuff, the bass, the drums, it sort of helped achieve this effect that I was going for. And then there's this low end cut, or this low mid cut, that gets automated to respond to the main vocal. So when the vocal is speaking, the this EQ ducks. Just to make room. You don't believe it. So there's that. Those are all the reverse vocal chops. Okay, next up is these background vocals, these oohs. And I'm doing a few things. On the bus, I'm distorting them with the 80 series plugin. Again, not doing anything other than boosting the preamp module. And then EQ. And I don't think, this EQ is not automated, so this is active throughout the whole thing. Again, like I said, a low end cut and then a little low mid range tuck. And this EQ is automating, and so in the first time, the first ooh section, it's rolling off low end and high end. And then by the second time, those all play back full bandwidth. And again, that's just movement throughout the track. Those are getting sent to that long haul reverb as just a steady send. And then there's only one of these that I'm processing individually, and that is the lower octave. Using a distressor, just keeping it kind of like a square wave. I don't want any dynamics. And then the next thing is a doubler that gets automated. just totally widens it out. And again, this just makes it feel different than the first time. Right? Versus okay. Next up is this, and this is just a little sample. Little choir thing, which I love and I think is super effective. I love little production devices like these that don't take up a lot of bandwidth in terms of frequency, or they don't pull a ton of attention or mask other elements, but they just punctuate really well. This is a really good example of something like that. So here it is.
My bones are ready. Turn on the
And it's on the upbeat, so it adds this, it just adds this sort of feel to the drums that I love. So only thing I'm doing is, again, low end cut. In this case, it's not so much a low mid range tuck as it is sort of like a harsh kind of resonant stuff. It's not the fundamental, it's just above some overtones. And then it's going to a chamber, which looks like this. I have two chamber reverbs that I tend to go to, this one and the Capital one from UAD. I like this one because it feels a little dirtier, maybe a little denser, which fit for this song. That's that. And then just two more. There's this soft harmony that happens.
You try and fake a love, you know you have.
Using the decapitator to bring out the articulation of the consonants. Listen to the K of fake.
You try and fake a love.
Versus.
You try and fake a love.
Obviously, it's not level match, but it just brings out the texture. And it doesn't read as distorted because there's so much going on during that section. And then again, perfect example of a low cut and then a mid-range cut. And this is going to the two plates and the lexicon, and it sounds like this with the rest of the track.
You try and fake a love, you know you have.
Then the last background vocal is this sort of harmony double.
You try and fake a love, you know you have.
And again, this is this kind of roomy thing. It actually sort of harkens back to this element.
Yeah. You know you have.
I feel like they sort of live in the same space, that sort of
You don't believe it.
sort of roomy feel. And so what I'm doing to it is I'm slamming it with an 1176, slow attack, fast release, just to honestly bring up some of the low level stuff and make it feel a little textural. And then it's, again, a doubler with the center channel sucked out, followed by just the low end cut.
You try and fake a love, you know you have. You know you have.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the mix bus, and then I just want to talk about some transition stuff. The first thing that I have in the mix bus, this is just a meter. The first thing that I have on the mix bus is this Better Maker EQ, which is essentially a Pultec emulation, and I'm just boosting 16K. And it really, here, I'll play that final refrain with.
Fake a love, you know you have. You know you have.
And without.
Fake a love, you know you have. You know you have. You don't.
I love this plug. I mean, it basically does what a Pultec does, which is just it can add excitement and kind of gloss without sounding hard or sterile or harsh. So there's the better maker, and then there's this imager, which is, I'm typically, again, reluctant to put this type of widening directly on an insert. Usually I'll put it in sort of like a parallel process. But this track could take it, and I really like what it does to the perspective. So here it is without.
You know you had, you
And
don't
with.
believe it. You know you had.
Obviously, there's a little bit of a level difference, but it just adds this sort of blooming dimension. It makes the vocal feel not so mono. That's something I can talk about. It's important that a vocal feels centered and grounded, but some tracks you want to be able to point to the middle of the speaker at the vocal, and some tracks it's okay if it feels a little bit more diffuse. This is an example of one of those where it's I felt like it was okay to feel a little bit spread out. Then this is an example of, trusting your ears and not your eyes. I think originally when I had this plugin, I had it set at a 30 dB scale. And so I just wanted a little bit of mid-range presence. So I boosted it a touch. And then you go to the 6 dB scale and you realize it's like 2 dB. But here's without.
You know you had. You don't.
Helps bring out some of the texture on the toms. I know on the toms we actually have a dynamic cut in this range, and it helps bring that back. But next up is this is a new-ish plugin from Plugin Alliance, and I put it on at the very last minute, and it's basically just doing I guess this is a range of 6 to 8K, just a little boost of about a dB. Put it on at the last minute. Here it is without.
You know you had.
With.
You don't believe it.
So you can hear it just adds some presence. And I sent two versions. I sent an A and a B to Isaac, and I asked him which one he preferred, and he liked it with this one. So we rolled with it. In hindsight, all of these EQs combined kind of have the effect of this. It's basically a high shelf sort of split between a bunch of EQs. But I just liked what each one was doing separately. Maybe if I had gone back, I would have just added a shelf. But I don't know. I oftentimes like sort of spreading tasks across a range of plugins, at least on the mix bus. So there's that. The other thing that's happening, it's not really the mix bus, but it's a parallel process, is this. And this is responsible for adding, sorry, I won't talk while it's playing. It's responsible for adding a lot of weight to the track. It's an ATR 102, so just a Ampex tape sim. The record is boosted all the way, and the bias is down, just to the point where it starts to break up. And then an imager. Again, and this one is not conservative at all. It is every single parameter boosted to the max. And, by itself it sounds ridiculous and phasey. And, but with the track, here it is without. And with.
My bones are ready. Turn on the radio.
Again, just adds density and width. And, this is something that you have to be really careful about. Not so much the mono compatibility thing, because it's 2022 and nobody's listening in mono. It's more the if you add too many wideners, nothing sounds wide anymore. You know, so I still rely on a lot of panning to achieve my stereo width. And like I said, typically I don't add this much widening on mixes, but I just tried it and I liked what it did. And that's really like the best piece of advice, is just try things, and if they sound good, then they are good. So that's basically it in terms of my processing. I just want to talk about a few things, and you know, I mentioned this in previous videos, is that I'm really serious about making sure that I nail my transitions, making sure that transitions feel really good and hit right, and so, you know, I don't always get it, but I always try. And in this case, there are kind of three transitions that felt really important. There's the transition between the verse and the chorus, which I sort of talked about and showed how there's a lot of filtering going on there. There's you know, high frequency roll-offs, and then and the low frequency cut in the bass, and then things open up in the chorus. So I'll just play that one more time.
My bones are ready.
The other transition that I didn't really talk about is the transition from the chorus back into the verse. And I am a big fan of making sure second verses hit right. I think that's one of the most important things in a song, is like after the chorus, making sure that you can return to a verse and not feel like it's a total energy drop, but not feeling like you're just at the same level, just making the verse just kind of like hit the pocket. So let me play that for you.
You think I'd carry on and make everything right?
Here's the rough mix during that part.
You think I'd carry on and make everything.
So there is a little bit of a difference in the level, and I'm not trying to like beat the rough mix or anything like that. When I'm mixing, I take level matching very seriously when I A/B between the rough mix and my mix, because it's easy to fool yourself into thinking that your mix is better than the rough simply because it's louder. In this case, the sectional dynamics are so different between the rough mix and my mix that if I had boosted the rough mix so that its chorus matched my chorus, then my verse, or its verse, would be way louder than my verse. And so this is sort of a very rough approximation of a level match, but it's not perfect. But anyways, the point is that in my mix, I'm doing, again, taking a little bit of a production liberty and sort of artificially constructing this moment of silence before the second verse. And let me just make sure that we're monitoring my mix again. Yeah. And so there's this sort of tension and release, and that is established in a few ways. The first is by monoing the guitar in that little break.
Think I'd carry on and make everything.
And then it's fully wide. Again, filtering the vocal for that section, rolling off top end, making it kind of pushed and radio-y before opening up.
And make everything right.
And then throwing the vocal to this long reverb, and then cutting it right when the snare drum hits. So finding some interplay between the actual arrangement and the played parts and the mix. And again, like when I'm doing this stuff, I really am not, I want it to feel like a moment, but I don't want it to feel distracting, or I don't want the listener to feel like, oh, there's some guy, twisting knobs and trying to trick me. It should all just flow and feel natural, and hopefully it does.
You think I'd carry on and make everything right. Just wait for a moment.
And then the final transition that I talked a little bit about in terms of the arrangement is going into the final refrain. And again, I added the church bell and the crystallizer on the synth, and I think that's all that I added. But the other thing that I did, or the two things that I did, was adding these one parallel process and then another thing. So I'm doing similarly to what I'm doing on the drum and bass bus with the tape plugin. I'm doing it here. It's basically the same thing. The glue is up to 100%, but I'm just in that very final refrain. Adding this terrible, trashy sounding thing that, again, by itself sounds terrible, but without it sounds, I'll just A-B it. Here's without. And here's with. Obviously, it's adding a little bit of level, but it's also just adding some thickness and some I don't know, just some juice to that final push, that final section. And then to help it is on the mix bus, I'm adding what is that? Yeah, 0.7 dB. And again, like I said before, I try and make changes like these with filtering and panning. Just because sometimes the mastering process just knocks these dynamic shifts right back down. But in this case, I thought that it was warranted, and it's not such a huge bump. And that section is exciting enough on its own. So if this were deleted, like, I'll play it without. Versus with.
Try and fake a love, you know you have. You know you have.
It helps, but it's not a night and day difference. So yeah, so that is. Let me just look through. Let me just glance at my notes real quick. Yeah, that's all I got. That's the mix. I just, in the interest of time, I'm not going to play the whole mix, but I will link it down below, just to the link on my website, and you can choose whatever streaming platform you use if you want to listen to the mix. A big thanks to Isaac for letting me do this breakdown, and yeah, I try and keep these pretty concise, but I feel like I end up talking a lot. So if you've stuck around this far, thank you for watching. And I am hoping to do more of these in the near future. I'm also hoping to get some artists involved and maybe do sort of some Zooms, where they talk about the production, talk about the song and what they did with it, and then kind of go in and we'll break down the mix together and sort of talk about the revision process. So I'm gonna try and get some of those on the books. But yeah, thank you for watching, and hope to do one of these again soon.